Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this midweek message. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Simon Parsons, and I'm a retired pastor. One of my favourite stories from the pages of the Old Testament is the story of the young Jewish girl, Esther. Now, Esther was descended from those Israelites who had been taken captivity into Babylon. She had been orphaned at a very young age and had been adopted by her cousin Mordecai, and they lived together in the capital city, Shushan. Now, through a series of events, Esther came to the attention of the King Xerxes, and eventually became his wife, and therefore the queen. One day, her cousin Mordecai learned of a plot by the Prime Minister Haman to exterminate all of the Jews in the province. He approached Esther and asked that she would intercede for the lives of her fellow Jews to the king. Seeking to encourage and to challenge Esther, Mordecai spoke these words: "For if you keep silence at such a time as this, the relief and deliverance for the Jews will rise from another quarter, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther approaches the king, and through her intervention, the Jews are spared the slaughter. Now, people who know me well and who have heard me preach more than once will be aware that from time to time I will come back to that phrase from the book of Esther. And who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. You see, I firmly believe that none of us are here by accident. We have been brought into the kingdom of God for such a time as this. We are here in this place at this time for God's purposes. Mordecai saw Esther as God's person in God's place for God's purposes and God's people at God's time. And we too are here for God's purposes and God's people at God's time. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells his followers that they did not choose him, but that he has chosen them for a purpose. And the words, of course, apply to us too. Now, I like the Passion Bible's translation of those verses from John's Gospel. Jesus says this: "You did not choose me, but I've chosen and commissioned you to play a part in God's plans and purposes." Now, maybe you can't see how this could possibly be true for you. Maybe you've never fully understood God's calling as you've come into God's kingdom. While I was a pastor in Brighton, we had an elderly lady in our congregation who was in her 90s. And in her own words, she had been born illegitimately, and she could not possibly see how God could use her at all. And yet, talking to that lady, we discovered that in fact, during her married life, she had fostered over 100 children. So, of course, God was using her for his plans and for his purposes at a specific time. A very dear friend of ours and her husband were called by God to adopt severely disabled children. And this they did. And in fact, those children had a home life full of love, full of laughter, full of joy that they may never have experienced any other way. And so you see, I believe that you and I have come to this place for such a time as this. God's planning, God's purposes are never random. His purpose for you and for me, for your life and for my life, was set into place even before we were born. And in fact, we're reminded of this in Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus. And this is what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 4. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. You see, God has given us position, resources, education, and much more. God has opened for us opportunities to optimize and to move forward his kingdom purposes. He didn't place you and me where we are so that we could sit down and eat figs all day or post pictures to social media. He's placed us where we are because you and I, folks, are in the midst of a battle, in the midst of a war. You and I are in the midst of a seismic conflict involving good versus evil. And rather than us saying, oh, well, I would do something great for God if only I had the opportunity. Maybe what we should be saying is, perhaps I have come into this position, into the kingdom of God, to the place where I am for just such a time as this. I have come to discover over the years that God has used me in certain situations, and I've realized the truth of those words, that God has called me into his kingdom for such a time as this. And let me challenge you, brothers and sisters. Why don't you ask God, Lord, why have you brought me into your kingdom for such a time as this? And wait for his reply and see how he will use you to further his kingdom in the days and weeks and months ahead of us. God bless you.